Some wounds run so deep they silence a man's voice for years. When Jeremiah Holt lost his boy, he retreated to the mountains and stopped speaking to the world below. But one cold morning, something drew him down to the Grafton Animal Shelter, where he found Patch, a broken pup with one torn ear that nobody wanted. The shelter worker called him the saddest dog she'd ever seen. When Jeremiah knelt down and offered his hand, the dog slowly raised his paw. That simple touch started something nobody expected. By winter's end, both man and dog were healed, and Jeremiah was teaching local children the old mountain ways his own son never got to learn. But how does finding one broken soul help a grieving father discover his purpose again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a forgotten prayer on the mountainside. Weathered cedar walls, standing sentinel against time and weather. Jeremiah Holt had built it with his own hands 23 years ago, back when hope lived in every nail he drove and every beam he raised. Back when the sound of a child's laughter echoed through these rooms like music, now silence pressed against the windows like snow, thick and suffocating. The morning light filtered through dust motes that danced alone, settling on furniture that hadn't been moved in 5 years. On the kitchen table, a hand-carved wooden truck sat exactly where Daniel had left it the morning he died, a toy truck Jeremiah had whittled during long winter evenings, painting it bright red because that was his boy's favorite color. The paint had faded now, like everything else in this house where time had stopped moving forward. Jeremiah sat in his father's old rocking chair, the same chair where he'd read bedtime stories and taught small fingers how to hold a fishing rod. His calloused hands, once steady enough to perform surgery in battlefield hospitals, now trembled slightly as they gripped his morning coffee. The cup was chipped. Daniel had knocked it off the counter when he was 7, running through the kitchen with muddy boots and wild hair. Jeremiah had meant to throw it away, but somehow never could. The worn leather Bible on the side table hadn't been opened since the funeral. Daniel had clutched it during his final weeks, when the cancer took his strength but not his spirit. "Read me the one about the mustard seed, Papa," he'd whispered those last nights. Jeremiah's voice had been strong then, steady and sure as he read about faith-moving mountains. Now the book gathered dust, its gold lettering faded. And Jeremiah wondered if faith was just another thing that died with the people you loved. Outside, the October wind rattled the shutters he'd painted green, because his late wife Emma had said it reminded her of spring. Everything in this house was a memorial to the dead. Emma, taken by pneumonia when Daniel was 12, and Daniel, stolen by leukemia at 17. The boy had fought for 2 years, smiling through chemotherapy and pretending the treatments didn't hurt, because he didn't want his father to worry. Even dying, Daniel had been trying to take care of everyone else. Jeremiah rose from the chair, joints protesting after another sleepless night. He was 58 now, though the mountain life had carved lines deeper than his years warranted. His dark hair had gone silver at the temples, and his beard showed white streaks that hadn't been there before Daniel's diagnosis. People in town used to say he looked like a young Paul Bunyan, broad shoulders, strong hands, eyes that crinkled when he smiled. These days, those eyes held shadows that no amount of mountain sunshine could chase away. He walked to the kitchen window and looked down at the valley below. Grafton spread along the river like a patchwork quilt, its main street lined with businesses that had been there since his grandfather's time. Morrison's General Store, where Daniel had bought penny candy every Saturday. The school where Jeremiah had built the playground equipment, watching his son master the monkey bars with determined concentration. The church where they'd said goodbye for 5 years. Jeremiah had watched the town from this distance, close enough to see the smoke from chimneys, but far enough to avoid the well-meaning looks of sympathy that had followed him everywhere after the funeral. Good people, all of them, but their kindness felt like salt in an open wound. They wanted to help him heal, not understanding that some wounds were meant to stay open, that forgetting felt like betrayal. The path down to town was overgrown now. brambles and wild grass, reclaiming the trail he and Daniel had worn smooth with daily walks. They'd hiked it every morning for years, Jeremiah pointing out animal tracks and teaching his son to read the forest like a book. Daniel had been a quick learner, eyes bright with curiosity as he memorized bird calls and learned to identify edible plants. He'd had plans to study wildlife biology, wanted to work for the Park Service and spend his life in places like this. Those dreams lay buried now in Grafton Cemetery, under a simple headstone that read, Daniel James Holt, beloved son. Jeremiah had wanted to add teacher of joy or friend to all creatures, but the words had seemed too small to contain what the boy had meant to the world. The kettle whistled, pulling him from the window. He'd put it on without thinking, old habits from a life that revolved around caring for others. As a young man, he'd been a medic in the army, serving 3 tours where his steady hands had meant the difference between life and death for soldiers not much older than Daniel. Later, he'd worked as a paramedic in Billings before Emma's pregnancy brought them to the mountains. He'd always been a healer, someone who fixed what was broken. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him that he couldn't fix the 2 people who mattered most. The morning dragged on with the weight of routine. Check the generator, split kindling, inventory, the pantry that held enough supplies for 1 person through another lonely winter. Every task felt mechanical, performed by muscle memory while his mind drifted to safer territory, the technical details of survival that didn't require him to feel anything. It was nearly noon when the restlessness hit. It came like this sometimes, a sudden need to move that drove him from the cabin's suffocating memories. Usually he'd hike the ridgeline or check his trap lines, work that kept his hands busy and his thoughts quiet. But today, something different pulled at him, a strange urgency he couldn't name. He found himself gathering his keys and wallet, actions that surprised him. He hadn't driven to town in 8 months, not since his truck had broken down and forced him to walk 3 miles for parts. The old Ford started reluctantly, coughing black smoke before settling into a rough idle. The radio crackled with static. He'd stopped listening to news or music years ago. Silence was easier. The drive down the mountain felt surreal, like entering a world he'd only observed from above. Houses he'd helped build during better times looked smaller somehow, and he noticed new paint colors, different cars in driveways. Life had continued without him as it should, as it must. Grafton's main street bustled with Saturday activity. Families loading groceries, teenagers gathered outside the ice cream shop, elderly couples walking hand in hand. Normal people living normal lives, unmarked by the kind of loss that carved you hollow. Jeremiah felt like a ghost observing the living, present but separate from their world of small joys and everyday concerns. He drove past Morrison's, past the post office where Mrs. Henderson still worked behind the same counter, past the cafe where he and Emma used to share Sunday breakfast after church. At the town's edge, where the road curved toward the interstate, sat a low building with a hand-painted sign, Grafton Animal Shelter, Every Life Matters. Jeremiah had never been here before. Daniel had always wanted a dog, but their mountain location made it impractical. Too many predators, too much wild country for a pet to survive. They'd compromised with the occasional injured animal that needed temporary care. Orphaned fawn, wounded hawk, lost coyote pup. Daniel had been gifted with animals, patient and gentle, in a way that made wild creatures trust him completely. The parking lot was nearly empty. Through the windows, he could see rows of chain-link runs and hear the distant sound of barking. Something drew him from the truck, the same inexplicable pull that had brought him down from the mountain. His boots crunched on gravel as he approached the entrance. Sarah Martinez looked up from her paperwork as the bell chimed. She was perhaps 35, with kind eyes and hands that showed the wear of working with animals. She'd been volunteering here for 3 years, ever since her divorce, finding purpose in caring for creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. "Can I help you?" she asked, then stopped. Everyone in Grafton knew Jeremiah Holt's story, though few had seen him since the funeral. "I'd like to see the dogs," he said. The words surprised him, his first conversation with another human being in 4 months. His voice sounded rusty, unpracticed. Sarah studied his face, seeing something there that made her nod. Of course. Follow me. The kennel area smelled of disinfectant and dog, not unpleasant but institutional. Most of the runs held energetic animals, labs and mixed breeds that bounded forward, tails wagging, hoping for attention. Their enthusiasm felt overwhelming after years of solitude. At the far end, in the last run, a small dog lay curled against the back wall. He was maybe 30 pounds, some mix of shepherd and terrier, with one ear that hung at an odd angle. His ribs showed through thin fur, and his dark eyes held a resignation that Jeremiah recognized immediately. "That's Patch," Sarah said softly. "He's been here 4 months. Someone found him on the highway, half-starved and scared. The ear was already damaged, probably from fighting or abuse. He won't eat much, doesn't play with the other dogs. Just sits there like he's given up." Jeremiah knelt by the chain link. The dog's eyes met his, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared pain, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that some wounds ran too deep for words. "Has anyone tried to adopt him?" "A few families looked, but he won't warm up to people. Kids especially make him nervous. Most folks want a pet that's friendly right away." Sarah's voice carried the weight of too many animals that never found homes. Jeremiah extended his fingers through the fence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly the dog lifted his head. Even more slowly, he approached the fence and sniffed Jeremiah's hand. The touch was gentle, questioning. "Hello?" "Boy," Jeremiah whispered, and his voice broke just slightly on the words. Patch sat back on his haunches and, in a gesture that seemed almost human, raised his right paw toward the fence. Jeremiah reached through and let the dog place his paw in his palm. It was a handshake between broken souls, a greeting that required no words. "I'll take him," Jeremiah said. The paperwork took 20 minutes. Sarah moved efficiently through the adoption process, occasionally glancing at Jeremiah with barely concealed curiosity. He answered her questions with single words when possible. Yes, he had experience with animals. No, he didn't have other pets. Yes, he understood the responsibility. She didn't ask about his long absence from town, or why he'd chosen the most broken dog in the shelter. Some stories told themselves in the lines around a man's eyes. When she opened Patch's kennel, the dog pressed himself against the back wall, trembling. Sarah attached a worn leather leash to his collar, donated equipment that had seen dozens of hopeful departures. Patch allowed himself to be led, but his head stayed low, ears flat against his skull. "He'll need time," Sarah said as they walked toward the parking lot. "Trauma like his doesn't heal quickly. The vet says he's physically healthy now, but the emotional damage runs deep," Jeremiah nodded, understanding more than she knew. The dog's fear was familiar territory, the way trust became impossible after the world proved it could take everything that mattered without warning or reason. At the truck, Patch balked. The tailgate was too high, and his injured body couldn't make the jump. Jeremiah lifted him carefully, feeling how thin the dog was beneath his fur. Patch didn't struggle, but his whole body went rigid with terror. In the truck bed, he curled into the smallest possible space, eyes wide and watching for the next threat. The drive up the mountain was silent, except for the engine's rumble and the wind through the cab windows. Jeremiah found himself checking the rearview mirror every few minutes, watching Patch huddle against the cold metal. The dog's fear was so complete, it seemed to fill the space between them, another passenger riding shotgun with their shared journey. At the cabin, Patch wouldn't leave the truck voluntarily. Jeremiah had to lift him down, feeling the tremors that ran through the small body. On solid ground, the dog immediately sought the darkest corner he could find, under the porch steps, where shadows offered the illusion of safety. "It's all right, boy," Jeremiah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." But Patch had heard promises before, and experience had taught him that human words meant nothing when pain was easier to deliver than kindness. Jeremiah went inside and opened a can of dog food, something he'd bought impulsively during his rare trips to Morrison's general store. He told himself it was for injured wildlife. But now he wondered if some part of him had been preparing for this moment without conscious thought. He set the bowl near the porch steps and retreated to the kitchen window, watching. For 2 hours, Patch didn't move. The smell of food reached him. Jeremiah could see his nose twitch, but hunger wasn't stronger than fear. Not yet. As evening painted the mountains purple, Jeremiah tried a different approach. He brought his own dinner outside, leftover venison stew and cornbread, and sat on the porch steps, eating slowly. He didn't look at Patch directly, didn't speak, just existed in the same space and let the dog learn that his presence didn't automatically mean pain. "You know," he said eventually, speaking to the mountains rather than the dog, "I had a boy once, Daniel. He was about your age when I first met him, scared of everything. Didn't trust easily." It wasn't exactly true. Daniel had been a baby when Jeremiah became his father, but the metaphor felt right. Took him months to believe he was safe. But once he did, once he knew nobody was going to hurt him anymore, he turned into the bravest kid you ever saw. Patch's ears moved slightly, tracking the sound of Jeremiah's voice. It was the first sign of interest he'd shown since leaving the truck. Of course, that was different, Jeremiah continued, his voice carrying 5 years of accumulated loneliness. "Daniel got sick and I couldn't fix him. Couldn't protect him from the one thing that mattered most. Maybe that's why you're here. Maybe we're both done trusting the world to be kind." The confession surprised him. He hadn't spoken Daniel's name aloud since the funeral, hadn't allowed himself to voice the guilt that ate at him like acid. What good was a lifetime of healing others if you couldn't save your own child? Darkness crept across the valley, and mountain cold began settling into the hollows. Jeremiah went inside and returned with an old quilt, one Emma had made during her first pregnancy, stitched with dreams of the family they'd built together. He spread it near the porch steps, close enough to offer warmth, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. "There's food when you're ready," he said, "and shelter when you want it. No pressure, no expectations, just a place to be safe while you figure out what comes next." Inside the cabin, Daniel's winter coat still hung by the door where he'd left it 5 years ago. It was a heavy parka, blue with reflective stripes, sized for a teenager who'd grown 3 inches his final year despite the treatments that stole his strength. Jeremiah had meant to donate it dozens of times, but his hands always stopped short of taking it down. It was such a small thing, a coat that would never be worn again, but removing it felt like erasing the last physical proof that Daniel had existed, had lived in this house, had belonged here. Through the kitchen window, he watched Patch creep toward the food bowl. The dog's movements were careful, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. He sniffed the contents thoroughly before taking a single tentative bite, then another. It was the first food he'd eaten willingly since arriving at the shelter. Sarah had mentioned, a small victory that felt enormous in the context of their shared brokenness. Jeremiah slept poorly that night, attuned to sounds from outside. Twice he rose to check on Patch, finding the dog curled on the quilt but alert, ears tracking every night sound the mountains offered. They were both learning to coexist with their fears, to function despite the certainty that loss was always waiting in the shadows. Morning brought frost and the sharp clarity that mountain air provided. Patch had moved closer to the cabin during the night, though he still maintained careful distance from the door. The food bowl was empty, another small progress in what Jeremiah sensed would be a long journey back to trust. He brought coffee outside and resumed his post on the porch steps. Patch watched him with less terror now, more curiosity than outright fear. When Jeremiah extended his hand, palm up and still, the dog approached slowly. This time, when Patch sniffed his fingers, he didn't immediately retreat. "That's it, boy," Jeremiah murmured. "One step at a time." The words echoed in his mind with unexpected weight. One step at a time. Advice he'd given Daniel during the hardest parts of treatment, when getting through each day felt impossible. Advice he'd forgotten to give himself after the funeral, when time stretched endlessly ahead, and every moment felt like betrayal of his son's memory. For the first time in 5 years, Jeremiah considered that maybe survival and living weren't the same thing. Maybe there was space between merely existing and honoring the dead. Maybe caring for something broken might teach him how to repair what cancer and grief had shattered in himself. When Patch finally allowed him to scratch behind his good ear, Jeremiah felt something shift inside his chest. Not healing exactly, but the possibility of it. Like ice beginning to crack after a long winter, letting the first light through. 3 weeks passed before Patch would enter the cabin. During those October days, Jeremiah established a routine that revolved around the dog's needs, feeding times when he sat quietly nearby, speaking in low tones about nothing important. The weather, the changing leaves, memories of Daniel that felt safe enough to share with someone who couldn't judge or offer unwanted comfort. "Your mama probably taught you to hunt," he said one morning, watching Patch sniff cautiously around the porch. "Daniel never got that chance. Lost his mother when he was 12, and I was too busy keeping food on the table to teach him proper woodcraft." His voice had grown stronger with use. No longer the rusty whisper of a man who'd forgotten how to speak to living things. Patch's ears perked at certain words. Hunt, mama, Daniel. Dogs understood tone better than vocabulary, and Jeremiah's grief carried a frequency that resonated with the animal's own trauma. They were learning each other's language slowly, built on shared loss rather than shared joy. The breakthrough came during a cold snap that threatened early snow. Jeremiah had left the cabin door open while he worked on splitting kindling, warm air spilling onto the porch. When he looked up, Patch was standing in the doorway, nose testing the interior scents. The dog's whole body trembled with the decision, caught between fear and the promise of warmth. "Come on, boy," Jeremiah said softly. "It's warmer inside?" Patch took one cautious step across the threshold, then another. His eyes darted constantly, mapping escape routes, but he moved deeper into the room until he reached the stone hearth where firelight danced against the walls. There he lay down, still ready to flee, but willing to trust the immediate safety of shared warmth. That evening, Jeremiah talked more than he had in years. With Patch curled near the fire, some barrier inside him cracked open. He spoke about Daniel's love for animals, how the boy could gentle a wild rabbit or calm a spooked horse with nothing but patience and soft words. He talked about Emma's laugh, the way she'd hum while cooking Sunday dinner, how she'd made this cabin feel like home instead of just shelter. "She would have loved you," he told Patch. Emma had a soft spot for broken things, always bringing home strays, animals, people, lost causes that needed mending. He paused, remembering. "Guess that's how she ended up with me." Patch listened with the focused attention animals give to human speech, hearing the emotion behind words even when meaning escaped him. His presence made confession easier somehow, non-judgmental, and requiring no response beyond the quiet companionship of shared space. In the workshop attached to the cabin, Jeremiah's whittling knife set lay wrapped in oiled leather, untouched since Daniel's death. These were tools his father had given him, carbon steel blades worn smooth by 3 generations of hands. He'd taught Daniel to use them the same way his own father had taught him, starting with soft pine, progressing to harder woods as skill developed. The boy had shown natural talent, patient enough for the detailed work, creative enough to see shapes hidden in rough wood. His last project had been a chess set, each piece carefully carved and sanded. The White King still sat unfinished on the workbench, lacking only final details when treatment became too difficult for steady hands. Jeremiah unwrapped the knives now, feeling their familiar weight. Patch watched from across the room as he selected a piece of cedar and began the first tentative cuts. His hands remembered the motions, thumb guiding the blade, wood shaving away in controlled curls. It felt like prayer, like meditation, like the closest thing to healing he'd experienced in 5 years. "Daniel loved this part," he said, not looking up from his work. "The way wood smells when it's fresh cut, how you can feel what it wants to become." The emerging shape was simple, a duck maybe, or a small dog. His hands seemed to know what they were making before his mind caught up. Patch rose and approached cautiously, drawn by the rhythmic scraping of blade against wood. When he settled beside Jeremiah's chair, close enough that his warmth pressed against the man's leg, neither acknowledged the significance of the moment. Trust was being built in small increments, each day adding another layer to the foundation they were constructing together. Outside, the first snow of winter began falling, fat flakes that caught the firelight through the window. Jeremiah worked quietly, muscle memory guiding his hands, while his mind wandered to easier times. He remembered teaching Daniel to identify different wood grains, the pride in the boy's eyes when he completed his first successful carving. Simple moments that had seemed ordinary then, but now felt precious beyond measure. "You remind me of him sometimes," he told Patch. "The way you watch everything, trying to understand how the world works." Daniel was like that, always asking questions, always wanting to know the why behind things. He paused in his carving, studying the dog's intelligent eyes. "Maybe that's what drew me to you at the shelter." Recognized something familiar. As the hours passed, Patch relaxed completely for the first time since arriving. The combination of warmth, food, and non-threatening human presence gradually convinced his traumatized nervous system that safety might actually be possible. When he finally laid his head on his paws and closed his eyes, Jeremiah felt something shift in his own chest, a loosening of the constant tension he'd carried for 5 years. The carved figure took shape slowly, revealing itself to be neither duck nor dog, but something between the two. A creature that might exist in dreams or children's stories, whimsical and kind. When Daniel was small, he'd peopled his imaginary worlds with such beings. Animals that could talk, trees that offered advice, rivers that sang lullabies. His creativity had been boundless then, before illness taught him that the world could be cruel as easily as magical. "He'd like you," Jeremiah said, holding up the finished carving. Daniel always said animals were better than people because they never pretended to be something they weren't. Patch opened one eye at the sound of his name, or perhaps at the change in Jeremiah's voice, which had grown warmer, less weighted with old grief. The dog's tail moved slightly, just the tip, but it was the first time Jeremiah had seen anything resembling happiness from the animal. That night, Patch slept inside for the first time, curled on a blanket near the fireplace. Jeremiah lay in his bed, listening to the soft sounds of another living creature sharing his space. Gentle breathing, the occasional shift of position, small noises that reminded him he was no longer completely alone. For the first time in 5 years, the silence in the cabin felt peaceful rather than oppressive. It was filled now with possibility instead of just echoes of what he'd lost. November brought the kind of crisp mornings that made breath visible and turned the world sharp-edged with frost. Patch had grown confident enough to explore the cabin freely, no longer startling at sudden movements or loud sounds. His ribs no longer showed through his coat, and the damaged ear had healed as much as it ever would. More importantly, his eyes had lost that hollow look of an animal that had given up hope. Jeremiah found himself talking constantly now, narrating his daily tasks for an audience of one who listened without judgment. As he prepared breakfast, he explained his grandmother's recipe for cornbread. While checking the generator, he described how mountain winters tested every system a man built. Patch absorbed it all with focused attention, as if understanding that these mundane details were actually lessons in how to live deliberately, how to find purpose in simple tasks. In the workshop corner, Daniel's fishing rod leaned against the wall where it had stood since the boys' final spring. The tip section had snapped during their last fishing trip together, a clumsy moment when Daniel's weakened coordination had failed him. Jeremiah had promised to fix it, but treatment schedules and hospital visits had pushed such repairs aside. After the funeral, touching anything that belonged to his son felt like desecration. But now, with Patch sleeping peacefully by the fireplace, Jeremiah found himself examining the break. The bamboo was clean split, repairable with the right technique and materials. His father had taught him rod repair when he was Daniel's age. Patient lessons in a garage that smelled of varnish and old leather. He loved fishing more than anything, Jeremiah told Patch as he gathered epoxy and silk thread. not for the catching so much as the being still, the waiting. Daniel understood that fishing was really about patience, about learning to exist quietly in the world until the world revealed its secrets. The repair work required steadiness and precision, qualities that grief had stolen from him. But as he wrapped silk thread around the joint, his hands rediscovered their certainty. Each turn of the thread felt like a prayer, a small act of restoration in a world that seemed bent on breaking everything good. Patch watched the process with keen interest, occasionally standing to sniff the materials or observe from a different angle. His curiosity reminded Jeremiah of Daniel's endless questions during similar projects. The boy had wanted to understand not just the how, but the why silk thread instead of nylon, why particular knots held better than others, why patience mattered more than speed. When the repair was complete, Jeremiah held the rod up to the light, testing the flexibility of the mended section. It felt solid, responsive, ready for the spring waters that still lay months away. But the accomplishment stirred something unexpected. Not just satisfaction at work well done, but anticipation. For the first time since Daniel's death, he found himself looking forward to something. "Guess we'll have to test this come spring," he said to Patch. "See if these old hands remember how to fool a trout." The dog's tail wagged, a full, enthusiastic response that transformed his entire demeanor. Jeremiah laughed, surprising himself with the sound. Laughter had been another casualty of grief, filed away with other expressions of joy that seemed inappropriate when your child was dead. That afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Jeremiah was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard voices on the trail, a woman calling and a child's higher pitch responding. Through the trees, he spotted Sarah Martinez hiking up the mountain path with a young boy in tow. Patch heard them first, ears pricked and body alert but not fearful. His time with Jeremiah had restored enough confidence that strangers no longer triggered immediate terror. When Sarah and the boy emerged into the clearing, Patch trotted forward to investigate, tail cautiously wagging. "Mr. Holt," Sarah called. "I hope we're not intruding. This is my nephew Tommy. He's been asking about Patch ever since I told him about the adoption." Tommy was perhaps 8 years old, with dark hair and bright eyes that reminded Jeremiah painfully of Daniel at that age. The boy knelt immediately when Patch approached, offering his hand palm up in the universal gesture of animal friendship. "He looks so much better," Tommy said, his voice filled with wonder as Patch sniffed his fingers. At the shelter he was so scared. Now he seems happy. The simple observation hit Jeremiah unexpectedly hard. Happy? Such a basic concept, yet one he'd forgotten applied to his own life. When had he stopped considering happiness as a possibility? When had mere survival become his highest aspiration? "He's settling in well," Jeremiah managed, his voice rusty from the surprise of conversation with humans other than Sarah. "Takes time to trust again after being hurt." Tommy nodded with the serious consideration children brought to important matters. "My mom says herd animals need extra patience. That's why Aunt Sarah works at the shelter, to help them remember that people can be good." Sarah smiled at her nephew's earnest explanation. "Tommy's been volunteering with me on weekends. He has a gift with the frightened ones." As if to prove her point, Patch settled beside Tommy, leaning against the boy's leg with complete trust. The sight stirred memories Jeremiah had been carefully avoiding. Daniel at this age, fearless with animals, gentle in ways that seemed innate rather than learned. "Would you like to see what we've been working on?" Jeremiah asked, surprising himself with the invitation. He led them to the workshop, where the carved figure from the previous evening sat on the workbench alongside Daniel's chess pieces. Tommy's eyes went wide. "You made these? They're amazing." He picked up the half-finished king, turning it carefully in small hands. "My grandpa carves too, but nothing this detailed." The boy's enthusiasm was infectious. Before Jeremiah fully realized what he was doing, he found himself explaining the different woods, the progression from rough cutting to final sanding. Tommy listened with rapt attention, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite curiosity. "Could you teach me?" Tommy asked suddenly. I mean, if you have time. I've always wanted to learn, but Grandpa lives too far away. The request hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Jeremiah wasn't sure he was ready to face. Teaching meant commitment, responsibility, emotional investment in another child's future. It meant risking the kind of attachment that made loss unbearable. But looking at Tommy's hopeful face, at Patch sleeping contentedly in the sunshine, at the repaired fishing rod that promised future adventures, Jeremiah felt something stirring that he'd thought was dead forever. Purpose, maybe, or simply the recognition that healing sometimes required opening yourself to new forms of love, even when the old wounds were still tender. I suppose we could start with something simple, he said finally. Next weekend, if your aunt doesn't mind bringing you up the mountain again. The following Saturday arrived with the promise of Indian summer, warm enough that Tommy could work outside without gloves. He'd arrived with Sarah just after dawn, practically vibrating with excitement and carrying a small backpack filled with what he called supplies. A notebook, 3 different pencils, and a sandwich his mother had packed. Jeremiah had spent the week preparing, gathering scraps of soft pine and organizing his tools. He'd forgotten how much thought went into teaching, the way you had to break down actions that had become automatic into steps small enough for inexperienced hands to follow. First lesson, he said, settling onto the porch steps with Tommy beside him, is learning to see the wood. Every piece has its own personality, its own grain and weakness. You work with what it wants to be, not what you think it should become. Tommy nodded seriously, accepting a piece of pine and turning it over in his hands. How do you know what it wants to be? The question stirred memories of Daniel asking the exact same thing 15 years ago. Back then, Jeremiah had answered with patience and metaphor, helping his son understand that wood carving was as much meditation as craft. Now, with grief still fresh enough to catch him off guard, the familiarity felt both comforting and painful. You look at the grain, he explained, guiding Tommy's fingers along the wood's surface. See how these lines flow? They're like a river. Follow them instead of fighting them, and your knife will move easier. Fight against them, and the wood will split where you don't want it to. Patch sprawled nearby, content to supervise the lesson. His presence had become essential to Jeremiah's daily routine, a warm anchor that kept him grounded in the present instead of drifting toward old sorrows. The dog had developed an uncanny ability to sense when memories threatened to overwhelm, offering the comfort of physical contact exactly when it was needed most. The morning passed slowly, deliberately. Jeremiah demonstrated basic knife grips, showed Tommy how to control the blade with his thumb, explained the importance of cutting away from his body. The boy was a quick learner, careful and focused in ways that reminded Jeremiah why he'd loved teaching Daniel. My dad says you used to be a soldier, Tommy said during a break, examining the small shavings he'd produced. Before you came to the mountains, Army medic, Jeremiah confirmed, not elaborating. His military service felt like another man's life now, connected to his current existence only by the scars it had left and the healing skills it had taught him. Did you save people? The directness of childhood cut through adult pretense. I tried to. Sometimes I succeeded, sometimes I didn't. That's the way it goes when people are hurt. You do what you can and hope it's enough. Tommy considered this with the gravity children brought to important concepts. Aunt Sarah says that's what you're doing with Patch, saving him. Jeremiah glanced at the dog, who had rolled onto his back in a patch of sunshine, completely relaxed. I think maybe we're saving each other. As the weeks passed, their Saturday sessions became a fixed point around which the rest of Jeremiah's week revolved. Tommy proved naturally gifted, his small hands steady and patient. More importantly, his enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Jeremiah of the joy he'd once found in creating something beautiful from raw materials. Other children began appearing. First Maria, Tommy's classmate, drawn by his excited reports of mountain adventures. Then the Peterson twins, curious about the mysterious man who lived above the clouds. Sarah facilitated these visits, understanding instinctively that both Jeremiah and the children were benefiting from the exchange. You're building something special here, she told him one afternoon, as they watched 5 children work carefully on their projects. Patch moved among them like a therapy dog, offering comfort to frustrated beginners and celebrating small victories with gentle tail wags. Jeremiah had retrieved his late wife's family photo from the bedroom drawer, where it had hidden for 5 years. Emma smiled from the silver frame, holding infant Daniel against her chest, both of them radiant with new parent joy. Jeremiah looked different too, younger, unmarked by the losses that would shape his later years. The photo now sat on the mantelpiece where it belonged, no longer too painful to display. Emma would have loved this, he said, watching Maria successfully complete her first simple carving. She always said children needed to learn things with their hands, not just their heads. Said it connected them to something real in a world that was getting too artificial. Sarah followed his gaze to the photo, understanding the significance of its presence. She sounds like she was wise, wiser than me anyway. If she'd lived, Daniel might have had brothers and sisters. This place might have been full of children's voices all along. The regret in his voice was old and familiar, but not quite as sharp as it once was. Maybe it still can be, Sarah said quietly. The conversation stirred something in Jeremiah that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. The idea of permanence, of building something that would outlast his own grief, felt both terrifying and compelling. For 5 years, he'd existed day by day, never looking far enough ahead to consider legacy or purpose. But watching these children discover skills that had been passed down through generations, seeing their pride in creating something beautiful with their own hands, he began to understand that teaching might be a form of healing he'd never considered. That evening, after the children had gone home with their projects and promises to practice, Jeremiah sat by the fire, with Patch sleeping across his feet. The cabin felt different now, not empty but expectant, as if waiting for the next weekend's laughter and learning. He picked up his carving knife and a piece of maple, letting his hands work without conscious direction. What emerged was another small animal, this one clearly a dog with alert ears and intelligent eyes. When he held it up to the firelight, Patch opened one eye and seemed to approve. "What do you think, boy?" Jeremiah asked. "Room for a few more broken things that need fixing?" Patch's tail thumped against the floor twice, which Jeremiah chose to interpret as wholehearted agreement. December brought the first serious snow, blanketing the mountains in white silence that muffled sound and transformed familiar landscapes into something otherworldly. The Saturday sessions moved indoors, the workshop warmed by a small wood stove that filled the space with the scent of burning cedar. 8 children now attended regularly, their carved animals growing more sophisticated with each lesson. Jeremiah had established a routine that felt natural despite its recent origins. Coffee before dawn, feeding Patch, checking weather conditions, then preparing materials for the day's instruction. The children arrived by mid-morning, brought up the mountain by parents who had grown to trust the hermit their kids spoke about with such affection. "Mr. Holt," Maria asked one snowy Saturday, "how did you learn all this stuff?" She was working on an ambitious project, a horse with flowing mane that required delicate detail work. Her concentration reminded Jeremiah of Daniel's intense focus when tackling challenging tasks. "My father taught me, same as his father taught him," Jeremiah replied, guiding her knife hand to follow the grain. "Some knowledge gets passed down because it's too important to let disappear." Tommy looked up from his own project, a bear that was becoming remarkably lifelike under his patient hands. "Will you teach your kids someday?" The question hung in the workshop air like smoke, touching something raw that Jeremiah thought had finally scabbed over. The other children continued working, unaware of the sudden tension. But Patch raised his head from where he'd been sleeping near the stove. "I had a son," Jeremiah said finally, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "Daniel, he would have been about your age when he got sick." The simple statement opened a door he'd kept carefully locked. But instead of the overwhelming flood of pain he expected, there was something else, warmth maybe. or the recognition that Daniel's memory belonged in this space, filled with young voices and creative energy. Did he like carving too? Maria asked with the gentle curiosity of children who understood loss better than adults often credited them. He loved it. Had more patience than me, better eye for detail. Jeremiah reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small carved bird, one of Daniel's last completed works. He made this the Christmas before he died, said it was a robin because they meant spring was coming, even in the darkest winter. The children examined the carving with reverent care, recognizing quality work when they saw it. The bird was exquisite, every feather suggested with minimal cuts, the whole piece balanced and alive despite being carved from dead wood. He was really good, the Peterson boy said with sincere admiration. Better than us. He had more practice, Jeremiah replied. Started when he was 6, worked at it for years before he got sick. That's what any skill takes. Time and patience and not giving up when things get hard. As the afternoon progressed, Jeremiah found himself sharing more stories about Daniel, not just the painful memories he'd carried alone for 5 years, but the good ones too. Daniel's first successful carving, a lopsided duck that had made Emma laugh until she cried. The chess set he'd planned as a Christmas gift for his father. The way he'd talked to injured animals, voice soft and confident in a way that calmed even the most frightened creatures. During a break, Sarah pulled him aside while the children played with Patch in the main cabin. "You've never talked about Daniel before," she said. "Not directly. Never seemed right somehow. Like talking about him made his being gone more real." Jeremiah watched through the window as Patch patiently endured being petted by 8 pairs of hands. But seeing him through their eyes, seeing how impressed they are with his work, it doesn't hurt the same way. Maybe that's because you're not remembering him alone anymore. Her insight struck deeper than he was prepared for. For 5 years, Daniel had existed only in Jeremiah's private grief, a shadow figure too precious and painful to share with the living world. But here, surrounded by children learning the same skills Daniel had mastered, his son's memory became something richer, not just loss, but legacy, not just ending, but continuation. That evening, Jeremiah made a decision that would have been impossible weeks earlier. From the bedroom closet, he retrieved a wooden box he hadn't opened since packing it after the funeral. Inside lay Daniel's journal, a leather-bound book where the boy had recorded his thoughts, dreams, and observations about the natural world he'd loved so deeply. With Patch curled beside his chair, Jeremiah opened the journal for the first time in 5 years. Daniel's handwriting filled the pages, sometimes rushed and careless, other times careful and deliberate when the subject mattered most to him. "Dad knows everything about the mountains," one entry read. "He can tell what kind of tree just by looking at the bark, and he knows which plants you can eat and which ones will make you sick. When I grow up, I want to know all the same things so I can teach kids about the forest." Dad says the best teachers are the ones who remember what it was like to not know something. The words blurred as Jeremiah read, not from tears, but from recognition. Daniel had seen something in his father that Jeremiah had forgotten about himself, the calling to pass knowledge to the next generation, to serve as a bridge between old wisdom and young eagerness. Another entry, written during the worst of the treatments. "The medicine makes everything taste weird, and my hands shake. But I can still carve a little bit every day." Dad says consistency matters more than perfection, that showing up every day is how you get good at anything. I think maybe that's true for getting well too. Jeremiah closed the journal carefully, understanding now why he'd been drawn to Tommy's request for instruction, why teaching these children felt like more than just passing time. It was Daniel's dream made manifest, his son's vision of sharing mountain wisdom with eager young minds. "You were right, boy," he said to Patch, who opened one sleepy eye at the sound of his voice. "About teaching being important, about it being what comes next." Outside, snow continued falling, adding to drifts that would isolate the mountain for months. But inside the cabin, surrounded by half-finished carvings and the lingering warmth of children's laughter, Jeremiah felt less alone than he had in 5 years. The storm hit on a Tuesday in mid-January, bringing winds that howled through the mountain passes like living things seeking shelter. Jeremiah had weathered dozens of such storms over the years, but this one carried a malevolence that made even Patch restless, pacing the cabin and whining at sounds only he could hear. By evening, the power was out and snow was falling so thick that the world beyond the windows disappeared into white static. Jeremiah had settled in for a long night of reading by kerosene lamp when Patch suddenly bolted upright, ears rigid with alert attention. "What is it, boy?" Jeremiah asked, but the dog was already moving toward the door, nose pressed to the crack beneath it. Then Jeremiah heard it too, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A voice, distant and desperate, calling for help through the wind. Without hesitation, he grabbed his heavy coat and boots, checking his emergency pack by muscle memory. Patch was already at the door, body tense with purpose Jeremiah had never seen before. Outside, the storm was worse than he'd realized. Snow stung his face like needles, and the wind threatened to knock him off his feet. But Patch moved with certainty, nose to the ground, following a scent trail invisible to human senses. "Find them, boy," Jeremiah shouted over the wind, and Patch took off down the mountain with the confidence of an animal born for this. They followed a path that led toward the children's favorite learning spot, a clearing where they often practiced fire building and basic survival skills. Through the storm, Jeremiah could make out a figure huddled against a massive pine, calling weakly for help. It was Emma Chen, one of Tommy's classmates, soaked through and shivering violently. She'd apparently gotten lost during what should have been a simple walk to her grandmother's house and had been wandering in the storm for hours. "I'm here." "Sweetheart," Jeremiah called, dropping to his knees beside her. "You're going to be okay." But even as he said it, he could see she wasn't okay. Her lips were blue, her skin pale and cold to the touch. Advanced hypothermia. He'd seen it enough times in military field hospitals to recognize the signs. Without immediate intervention, the child would die. Training took over, instincts honed during 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Jeremiah's hands moved automatically, checking pulse and breathing, assessing core temperature, calculating the fastest route to warmth and safety. "Stay with me, Emma," he said, wrapping her in his own coat before lifting her small body against his chest. "Patch, home. Fast as you can." The dog led them back through the storm with unerring accuracy, somehow finding paths Jeremiah couldn't see through the driving snow. At the cabin, he carried Emma inside and immediately began the rewarming process. Techniques learned not in civilian life but in Army field medicine courses where saving lives under impossible conditions was just another day's work. Strip away wet clothes. Wrap in dry blankets. Check for frostbite. Monitor breathing. Start an IV for fluid replacement. Skills he hadn't used in 15 years, but that came back like riding a bicycle. As he worked, muscle memory triggered other memories. The field hospital outside, Kandahar, where he'd saved a wounded Afghan girl not much older than Emma. The convoy medic position, where his steady hands had meant survival for dozens of soldiers who might otherwise have died before reaching proper medical care. The commendations and citations he'd never told Daniel about. Afraid of glorifying war to a son who saw his father as a healer, not a fighter, Emma's temperature began rising slowly, her breathing becoming more regular. Color returned to her lips. She would live, thanks to training Jeremiah had hidden from everyone who mattered to him. Skills he'd tried to forget because they reminded him of a younger man who'd believed he could save everyone. "You're going to be fine," he told Emma as her eyes fluttered open. "Just rest now. You're safe." The storm raged for 3 more hours before breaking enough for the rescue helicopter to reach them. By then, Emma was sitting up, drinking hot soup and petting Patch with hands that had regained feeling and warmth. "How did you know what to do?" Sarah asked as they watched the helicopter disappear toward the Valley Hospital. She'd arrived with the rescue team, her face tight with worry that had only begun to ease when she saw Emma conscious and talking. Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment. watching the storm clouds break apart to reveal stars he hadn't seen in days. The metal box in his closet contained more than just Daniel's journal. It held things he'd never shared with anyone. 3 Bronze Star medals, a Purple Heart, commendations for valor under fire, citations for lives saved under conditions that would have broken lesser men. I was a combat medic in Afghanistan, he said finally. 3 tours, saved a lot of soldiers who might not have made it home otherwise. Sarah stared at him, recalibrating everything she thought she knew about the quiet mountain man who'd become such an important part of her life. You never mentioned military service. Didn't seem relevant. That was another life, another person. I came here to get away from all that, to be just a father and husband instead of someone who'd seen too much death. But those skills, they saved Emma tonight. Jeremiah nodded, understanding for the first time that perhaps his past wasn't something to be hidden from, but integrated into who he'd become. Daniel never knew. Didn't want him to think of me as a soldier first, father second. But maybe I was wrong to hide it. Maybe all of it. The medical training, the survival skills, even the hard parts. Maybe it's all connected to what I'm supposed to be doing now. Patch sat between them, alert and proud, as if he'd known all along that Jeremiah carried more than grief in his careful silence. The dog's behavior during the rescue had been remarkable. Not just pet-level helpfulness, but genuine search and rescue instincts that suggested training or natural ability far beyond the ordinary. Where did Patch come from? Sarah asked suddenly. I mean, before he ended up at the shelter? Highway patrol found him wandering near the interstate. No tags, no chip, no record of where he belonged. But the way he tracked Emma tonight, the way he knew exactly what to do, that's not accidental behavior. That's professional-level search and rescue. Jeremiah looked down at Patch, who gazed back with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own. Maybe we both found each other for reasons we didn't understand at the time. As the rescue team packed their equipment and prepared to leave, the town deputy approached Jeremiah with an expression of newfound respect. Word's going to get out about what you did tonight, he said. Folks are going to want to know how a mountain hermit became the best field medic in 3 counties. Jeremiah considered this, understanding that his carefully maintained anonymity was about to become impossible. The children who came for wood-carving lessons would learn that their teacher was also a decorated combat veteran. Sarah would see him differently. The whole community would want to understand how a man they'd thought they knew had kept such a significant part of himself hidden. But looking at Emma, safe and warm and alive because of skills he'd tried to forget, Jeremiah realized that hiding had been its own form of death, not just for him, but for everyone who might have benefited from what he'd learned in places where healing was a matter of life and death. Let them know, he said finally. Maybe it's time to stop pretending I'm only one thing. News of the rescue spread through Grafton like ripples on still water. By week's end, Jeremiah found himself fielding phone calls from reporters, visit requests from veterans organizations, and offers from the county to formalize his role as a mountain rescue coordinator. The quiet life he'd built around grief and isolation was dissolving faster than snow in spring rain. You saved my daughter's life, Emma's father said, when he climbed the mountain path on Saturday morning. David Chen was a soft-spoken man who owned the town's hardware store, someone Jeremiah had seen but never spoken to during his rare trips to town. I don't know how to thank you properly. No thanks needed, Jeremiah replied, uncomfortable with gratitude that felt too large for what he'd simply seen as necessary action. Anyone with medical training would have done the same. But you weren't just anyone, were you? David's voice carried a weight of understanding. Emma told us about your medals, about what she overheard the deputy saying. Combat medic, 3 tours, bronze stars, you're a genuine hero. The word sat wrong in Jeremiah's chest. Heroes were what you called dead soldiers, not broken men who'd retreated to mountains because they couldn't save the people who mattered most. That afternoon brought more visitors, parents wanting to express gratitude, children eager to hear stories about their teacher's secret past. Sarah with questions she was still too polite to ask directly. Through it all, Patch remained close, seeming to sense that his human was struggling with unwanted attention. "You don't like being called a hero," Sarah observed after the crowd had dispersed. She sat beside him on the porch steps, watching the sun set behind peaks that would soon be impassable until spring. "Heroes don't let their own children die while they're off saving strangers," Jeremiah said, the words bitter as old coffee. "Heroes don't hide in the mountains for 5 years, feeling sorry for themselves. Heroes are just people who do what needs doing when everyone else is too scared or unprepared," Sarah countered. "Emma's alive because you were exactly where you needed to be, with exactly the skills she needed." "That's not coincidence." Before Jeremiah could respond, Patch suddenly stood, ears pricked toward the forest. His body language had shifted to high alert, not playful attention, but the focused intensity Jeremiah had seen during the storm rescue. "What is it, boy?" he asked, rising to follow the dog's gaze. Through the trees, he caught a glimpse of movement. Large, dark, moving with the deliberate gait of something injured or desperate. There, his mind identified automatically, and from the way it moved, something was very wrong. "Sarah, get inside," he said quietly. "Call the wildlife department. Tell them we have a wounded bear near the children's learning area." The irony wasn't lost on him. For weeks, the clearing where he taught woodcarving had become a symbol of healing and renewal. Now it was threatened by exactly the kind of danger that made mountain life unpredictable and sometimes deadly. Sarah's call to the wildlife department confirmed his worst fears. A female black bear, likely wounded by poachers, had been spotted several times in the past week. She was aggressive, unpredictable, and territorial, protecting cubs that might or might not have survived whatever had injured her. "They're sending a team up tomorrow," Sarah reported. "But they said if she feels cornered, she could attack anyone who gets too close to what she considers her territory." Jeremiah spent that evening studying Daniel's hand-drawn map of their property, a childish treasure map that had become an inadvertent survey of every trail, stream, and hiding place within 5 miles of the cabin. Daniel had been thorough in his exploration, marking caves and thick brush areas where animals might den, rocky outcroppings that offered vantage points, even seasonal patterns he'd observed over years of patient watching. "Look at this," he said to Sarah, pointing to a series of marks near the children's learning area. "Daniel mapped a whole cave system here. If the bear's denning nearby, this is probably where." The cave entrance was barely visible from the surface, hidden behind fallen logs and thick brush. But Daniel's map showed it connected to a larger underground network, perfect shelter for an injured animal with cubs, and perfectly positioned to make the children's favorite gathering spot extremely dangerous. "We need to relocate the bear before Saturday," Jeremiah said. 8 kids come up here every week. If she's territorial and wounded, someone's going to get hurt. "The wildlife team will handle it," Sarah protested. "That's their job. Their job is to put her down if she's too dangerous to relocate. Mine is to make sure no children get hurt while we figure out which she is." That night, Jeremiah couldn't sleep. He found himself walking the cabin, checking and rechecking his emergency medical kit, the same battered case he'd carried through 3 deployments. Inside were supplies that had saved lives in places where death was always 2 minutes away. Trauma dressings, morphine injectors, surgical instruments designed for field conditions. Patch followed his restless movement, occasionally nudging his hand with gentle insistence. The dog had been different since the rescue, more alert and purposeful, as if Emma's crisis had awakened something in him that had been dormant since his arrival at the shelter. "You know what's coming, don't you?" Jeremiah asked, kneeling to scratch behind Patch's good ear. "Feel it building like a storm." Sunday morning brought the wildlife team, 3 officers with tranquilizer equipment and protocols that prioritized public safety over animal welfare. Their plan was simple: track the bear to her den, assess her condition, and either relocate or destroy her based on the level of threat she presented. "We appreciate your concern," the lead officer told Jeremiah, "but this is really a job for professionals. Wounded bears are unpredictable, and civilians can get hurt trying to help." Jeremiah didn't argue, but he also didn't retreat to his cabin. Instead, he positioned himself where he could observe their operation while staying close enough to intervene if things went wrong. His military training had taught him to trust official protocols while maintaining independent situational awareness, a skill that had saved lives when rules met reality under fire. The team found the den exactly where Daniel's map indicated, hidden in the cave system that honeycombed the mountain beneath the children's learning area. But their approach spooked the bear before they could get close enough for a clean tranquilizer shot. She emerged from the cave in full defensive mode, 6 feet of muscle, claws, and maternal fury protecting something precious hidden in the darkness behind her. The officers raised their weapons, protocols shifting from capture to elimination as the threat level escalated beyond their comfort zone. "Wait!" Jeremiah called, moving carefully into their line of sight. "She's not attacking. She's defending." "There's a difference. Sir, you need to stay back," the lead officer warned. "This animal is dangerous." "She's scared," Jeremiah corrected, studying the bear's posture with eyes trained to assess threat levels under pressure. "Look at her stance. She's not preparing to charge. She's trying to make herself look bigger to drive us away from her cubs." The bear rose on her hind legs, a display of size meant to intimidate rather than attack. Jeremiah could see the wound now, a deep gash along her left shoulder, probably from a poacher's bullet that had missed its mark. She was in pain, protecting young, and cornered by humans who might finish what others had started. "She needs medical attention, not elimination," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made life and death decisions under conditions most people couldn't imagine. "Give me 5 minutes to assess her condition properly." The officers looked at each other uncertainly. They'd been briefed about Jeremiah's background, his decorated service record, his expertise in field medicine. But protocols were protocols, and wounded bears didn't wait for perfect solutions. 5 minutes, the lead officer agreed reluctantly. "But if she charges, we take the shot," Jeremiah nodded, understanding the stakes completely. He was about to bet his life on skills he'd learned healing humans in war zones, hoping they translated to saving animals in the mountains he'd come to call home. Jeremiah moved with the deliberate calm that had kept him alive in Afghanistan, each step calculated to communicate non-aggression while maintaining tactical awareness. The bear watched him approach, massive head swiveling to track his movement, while her body remained positioned between him and the cave entrance. "Easy, Mama," he said softly, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used with Daniel during the worst of his treatments. Steady, reassuring, completely without fear. "Nobody's here to hurt your babies." Patch had followed him down the trail, ignoring Sarah's attempts to call him back. Now the dog positioned himself at Jeremiah's left side, alert but not aggressive, his body language mirroring his human's calm authority. Together, they presented a united front that somehow communicated safety rather than threat. The bear dropped to all fours, still defensive, but no longer in full attack posture. Jeremiah could see the wound clearly now, a bullet graze that had torn through muscle and fat without hitting bone or vital organs. Painful, infected, but not fatal if treated properly. From his emergency medical kit, he withdrew a preloaded morphine injector, calculating dosage based on body weight and condition. The bear couldn't weigh more than 300 pounds, probably closer to 250, given her obvious malnutrition. Field medicine wasn't just about healing, it was about rapid assessment under pressure, making life-saving decisions with incomplete information. "What are you doing?" The lead wildlife officer called from his position 20 yards away. "What I should have done for Daniel," Jeremiah replied, not taking his eyes off the bear. "What I know how to do." The injector was designed for human use, but pain was universal. He approached slowly, letting the bear see the device, allowing her to make the choice to trust or flee. Behind her, from the cave's darkness, came the sound that explained everything, the high-pitched mewing of cubs too young to survive without their mother. "She's not aggressive," Jeremiah called back to the officers. "She's desperate. There's a difference, and it matters." The bear allowed him to come within arm's reach, her dark eyes fixed on his face with intelligence that seemed almost human. When he pressed the injector against her shoulder, she flinched but didn't attack. The morphine would take minutes to work, but its effect would be dramatic, pain relief that allowed clear thinking instead of panic-driven survival responses. As the medication took hold, the bear's posture relaxed visibly. The constant tension of guarding against further pain eased, and with it, the defensive aggression that had made her seem so dangerous. She was still a wild animal, still protective of her cubs, but no longer operating from a place of desperate fear. Jeremiah reached into his kit again, this time withdrawing antiseptic and trauma dressings. The wound would need professional veterinary care, but field cleaning would prevent further infection until proper treatment could be arranged. "You're going to be fine," he told the bear, applying antiseptic with the gentle efficiency of thousands of similar procedures performed under far worse conditions. "Your babies too. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The bear submitted to his treatment with remarkable calm, occasionally glancing toward the cave, but no longer positioning herself for immediate defense. Patch maintained his vigil beside Jeremiah, serving as an early warning system for any change in the situation's dynamics. From the cave came the sound of movement. 2 cubs, probably born late in the season, emerging cautiously to investigate the strange humans who'd invaded their sanctuary. They were perhaps 4 months old, still dependent on their mother, but large enough to survive relocation if necessary. "Radio for a veterinary transport," Jeremiah called to the wildlife team. "Mother and cubs, non-emergency medical evacuation. They'll need somewhere safe to finish healing before release." The lead officer lowered his weapon completely, understanding that the situation had shifted from dangerous wildlife encounter to rescue operation. "How did you know she wouldn't attack?" "Same way I knew wounded soldiers wouldn't shoot medics who came to help them," Jeremiah replied, securing the last piece of tape over the bear's bandaged shoulder. "Pain makes everything worse. Thinking, judgment, trust. Take away the pain, and you can usually find the person underneath, or the animal in this case." Sarah had moved closer during the treatment, drawn by fascination with Jeremiah's transformation from grieving hermit to confident field medic. This was the man who'd earned 3 bronze stars, she realized. Someone who could function under pressure that would paralyze most people. "Where did you learn veterinary care?" she asked. "Afghanistan. We treated wounded dogs all the time, bomb detection animals, guard dogs, strays that the soldiers adopted. Pain is pain, and healing follows the same principles whether you're working on humans or animals." The bear stood slowly, testing her weight on the treated shoulder. The morphine had provided significant relief, and the antiseptic cleaning had removed the infection's toxic load. She would need ongoing care. But the immediate crisis had passed. As the veterinary transport arrived, a specialized trailer designed for wild animal relocation, Jeremiah felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time since Daniel's death, he'd used his medical skills not to fight a losing battle against death, but to preserve life that could be saved. It was a distinction that mattered more than he'd realized. The bear cubs emerged fully from the cave as their mother relaxed, 2 small black forms that tumbled over each other with the fearless curiosity of young animals who'd never learned to distrust the world. They approached Patch first, drawn by his calm demeanor and non-threatening posture. The dog sat perfectly still as they sniffed around him, their tiny noses working to catalogue this strange new presence in their territory. "Remarkable," the veterinary technician said as she prepared the transport crate. "I've never seen wild bears this calm around humans. Usually, it takes heavy sedation just to get them loaded." Jeremiah watched the cubs explore their immediate area, staying close to their mother but no longer cowering in the cave's darkness. Fear was making them act desperate. Take away the fear, and they behave like what they really are: intelligent animals who want to survive without conflict. As the cubs investigated Patch, one of them, bolder than his sibling, approached Jeremiah's medical kit. The bear cubs sniffed at the trauma dressings, then looked up at the man who'd brought relief to his mother's pain. In that moment, Jeremiah saw something that reminded him powerfully of Daniel, curiosity unmarked by cynicism, trust offered without reservation. The cub's investigation was interrupted when Patch suddenly rose to his feet, head cocked toward the forest with alert attention. His ears swiveled like radar dishes, tracking sounds the humans couldn't yet hear. "What is it?" Sarah asked, following the dog's gaze into the tree line. Through the forest came the sound of voices, young voices calling excitedly to each other. The Saturday morning wood-carving group, hiking up early for their lesson, unaware that their favorite gathering spot had become a wildlife rescue operation. The children, Jeremiah said, understanding immediately that 8 curious kids approaching a bear family would transform a controlled situation into potential tragedy. "They don't know to stay away." He could hear Tommy's voice among the others, leading his friends up the familiar trail with the confidence of someone who considered this mountain his second home. In minutes, they would crest the ridge and find themselves face to face with wild animals whose behavior, despite current calm, remained unpredictable. "Sarah, intercept them," Jeremiah said urgently. "Keep them back until we get the bears loaded." But Sarah was already moving, hiking quickly toward the voices with Patch at her side. The dog had understood the situation's dynamics before any of the humans, his protective instincts extending naturally to the children who'd become part of his pack. Left alone with the bears and the wildlife team, Jeremiah found himself in a position he'd occupied countless times in military field hospitals, responsible for multiple lives simultaneously, managing complex variables while maintaining focus on the primary mission. The mother bear was stable but not fully sedated. The cubs were calm but still wild animals. The children were approaching with innocent enthusiasm that could trigger defensive responses. How long for the sedative to take full effect? He asked the veterinary technician. Another 10 minutes for complete unconsciousness. But she's already drowsy enough for safe handling. The mother bear had indeed grown sleepy, the combination of pain relief and mild sedative making her movements sluggish. She watched the humans with reduced wariness, more concerned with staying close to her cubs than maintaining defensive postures. One of the cubs had found Jeremiah's emergency bandages particularly interesting, and pawing gently at the cloth with the same delicate touch Jeremiah had seen in Daniel's hands when the boy worked on detailed carvings. The memory triggered an unexpected recognition. This cub's careful exploration mirrored his son's approach to understanding new things, patient and thorough rather than rushed. "Easy there." "Little one," Jeremiah said softly, gently retrieving his supplies. To dress the small wound on the cub's paw, a minor scrape from scrambling over rocks, he tore a strip of cloth from Daniel's old shirt, which he'd carried in his kit since the funeral. The fabric had been too precious to use for anything but the most important purposes. As he wrapped the makeshift bandage around the cub's paw, Jeremiah felt something profound settle into place inside his chest. This was what healing looked like, not the desperate fight against inevitable death he'd waged in hospitals and battlefields, but the quiet preservation of life that could be saved, the protection of innocent things that deserved to grow and thrive. The cub submitted to his ministrations with remarkable trust, as if recognizing the healing intent behind human touch. When Jeremiah finished, the small bear looked up at him with dark eyes that held no fear, only the recognition that pain had been replaced by comfort. Sarah's voice carried clearly through. The forest, as she explained to the disappointed children why they couldn't proceed to their usual meeting spot. Their understanding acceptance, these kids trusted their teachers completely, reminded Jeremiah of the responsibility he'd taken on without fully realizing its weight as the transport team successfully loaded the drowsy bear family. Jeremiah understood that something fundamental had changed in his relationship with his own past. His military training, his medical skills, even his grief over Daniel, all of it had led to this moment where saving became possible again. 6 months later, Spring had transformed the mountain from winter's stark monochrome into a canvas of impossible greens. The children's learning area had been rebuilt and expanded, featuring permanent workbenches, tool storage, and a rustic pavilion that could accommodate twice as many students as before. A hand-carved wooden sign marked the entrance. Daniel's Den Mountain Skills Workshop, created collectively by Jeremiah and 15 children, whose steady hands had learned to guide blades with precision and patience. The morning sun filtered through new leaves as Jeremiah prepared for another Saturday session. His routine had evolved to accommodate success: coffee before dawn, feeding Patch, reviewing lesson plans that now included basic wilderness medicine alongside traditional woodcraft. The children who climbed the mountain path each weekend numbered 23 now, ranging in age from 6 to 16, all drawn by word-of-mouth reports of the mountain man who taught skills their grandparents had known but their parents had forgotten. Patch had become something of a local celebrity, his picture appearing in the regional newspaper alongside the story of the bear rescue. More importantly, he'd grown into his role as official therapy dog and teaching assistant, moving among the children with intuitive understanding of who needed encouragement and who needed space to work through frustration. "He's got better instincts than most people," Sarah observed, watching Patch comfort Maria, who was struggling with a particularly challenging carving. The dog positioned himself beside her chair, offering the calming presence that helped anxious children find their center. Sarah had become Jeremiah's unofficial partner in running the workshop, her background in veterinary care complementing his medical and survival skills. Their relationship had deepened gradually, built on shared purpose rather than romance, though Jeremiah suspected romance might follow in its own time. For now, it was enough to work alongside someone who understood that healing happened slowly, in small increments that accumulated into transformation. "Mr. Holt," Tommy called from his workbench, holding up a completed project. "Is this ready for finishing?" The boy had progressed remarkably over the months, his natural talent nurtured by consistent instruction and endless patience. The carving he displayed, a detailed replica of Patch, captured not just the dog's physical appearance, but something essential about his character. The alert intelligence and gentle strength that made him perfect for this work. "That's fine craftsmanship," Jeremiah said, examining the piece with genuine admiration. "Your grandfather would be proud." Tommy beamed at the praise, then grew thoughtful. "Do you think Daniel would have liked it?" The question no longer triggered the sharp pain that mention of his son's name had once caused. Instead, Jeremiah felt the warm recognition that Daniel's memory lived not in careful preservation, but in active continuation of what he'd loved. "He would have been amazed by your skill," Jeremiah replied honestly. "Daniel always said the best compliment you could give another carver was to want to learn from them. He'd definitely want to learn from you." In the cabin, Emma's family photo had been joined by others, group pictures from workshop sessions, snapshots of successful projects, images that documented not what had been lost, but what was being built. The worn leather Bible sat open now on the kitchen table, no longer gathering dust, but consulted regularly for the wisdom it contained about perseverance, hope, and the mysterious ways that broken things could be made whole. The workshop had grown beyond simple craft instruction. Parents reported that children who'd been struggling with confidence or anxiety showed remarkable improvement after spending time in the mountains. Kids who'd never succeeded at anything discovered talents they didn't know they possessed. Teenagers who'd been drifting found direction in learning skills that connected them to something larger than themselves. "We're going to need more space soon," Sarah said, surveying the bustling workshop, where every available surface was occupied by young craftspeople and their projects. "Already thinking about it," Jeremiah replied. "There's a clearing about a quarter-mile up the ridge that would work perfectly for expansion. Daniel and I used to camp there when he was small. He always said it felt like the center of the world." The afternoon brought a special visitor, Emma Chen, now fully recovered from her winter ordeal and eager to try woodcarving for the first time. Her father accompanied her up the mountain, carrying a thank-you gift that made Jeremiah's throat tighten with emotion. A framed letter from the governor, officially recognizing his contributions to mountain rescue and youth education. "You probably don't want another certificate," David Chen said, understanding that recognition wasn't what motivated the man who'd saved his daughter. But Emma insisted you needed to know how many lives you've touched. As the day wound down and children gathered their tools and projects, preparing for the week ahead, Jeremiah felt the deep satisfaction that came from work aligned with purpose. This was what Daniel had envisioned in his journal. Knowledge passed to eager young hands, wisdom shared across generations. Healing that happened through creating rather than just enduring. A new child appeared at the edge of the clearing as the others prepared to leave. A shy girl, perhaps 7 years old, holding her mother's hand and watching the workshop activity with barely contained longing. She reminded Jeremiah of Patch that first day at the shelter. Wanting to trust, but afraid of disappointment, Patch approached the newcomer slowly, offering the same gentle paw that had started everything months ago. The little girl knelt to pet him, her face lighting up with the kind of joy that erased whatever sadness had shadowed her arrival. "Would you like to try carving something?" Jeremiah asked, his voice carrying the same patient kindness that had once helped a broken dog learn to trust again. As the girl nodded eagerly and her mother smiled with relief, Jeremiah understood that this was how healing really worked, not as a destination reached, but as a gift passed forward. Unbroken soul helping another discover that wholeness was possible, that love lost could become love shared, that the best way to honor the dead was to serve the living with everything you'd learned from both joy and sorrow. The circle remained unbroken, growing wider with each new heart that found its way to healing.